And this is not a classroom, so you don't need to raise your hand. I will not call on you, but I am going to do what I do when I teach, which is sit on the table and wave my legs back and forth. So, what comes to your mind when you think of the LGBTQ community? Yes?
Well, first of all, I have a question.
Yes.
And that is, now I may be showing my age, but the Q piece, as I understand, is queer. In the past, to me, that has always been a pejorative, prejudicial term. And it seems to me that it's only recently that that has been added to the acronym. Can you explain to me why it was added and why is it no longer pejorative?
Absolutely, and that's a fantastic question. I was born in 1991, and I remember in the 90s and early 2000s, the word queer was still pejorative. I know, way back when. I'm going to knock over the table, so I'm going to stand back up. We don't need an injury to start the evening out. But yes, the Q and LGBTQ, and I have a slide later where we can talk about it. I might bring that up now, actually. It shows what the individual letters mean. Q does stand for queer. It can also stand for questioning. If you're unsure of your orientation or gender identity, you might identify as Q. But yes, queer, up until quite recently, was used as a slur. But it isn't anymore. And one of the reasons why not only has it been sort of taken on as a sort of badge of honor by people who don't feel like they fit neatly into the L, the G, the B, or the T, but it also sort of encompasses this term that covers all of them. So if I were to say to you, I am queer, that could mean that I'm anything on that list, that I identify as different, but not necessarily as one of those categories. So just really quickly while we're up here, I have several letters here. I have LGBTQIA and then a plus sign. Those are the ones that you see most often in the acronym, but I have left out some because there are many, many more. But usually L stands for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender, Q for queer or questioning, I for intersex, A for asexual and ally, and a plus for other identities. I'm going to go back and do these one by one, don't worry. Do you want me to go through this now, or did we want to talk first? Let's talk first. What else comes to your mind? Yeah.
We kind of made a list.
Great.
But it started with, the first thing that comes to my mind is always the pain and suffering of this community that's gone on for so very long.
Yes.
I only became aware of this, well, many years ago when I was in my early teens. And it troubled me so terribly then, and it continues to as I become an older person. It still troubles me a lot. That by now we haven't figured this out. How we're all just people, as we concluded, with problems and difficulties, and we need each other's help and so on. Somebody else mentioned that a lot of times it's the fear of what's not known or not understood that makes people rejecting of something they don't understand. And in a way, ideally, aren't we all in the community, no matter what, whether we fit in there or anywhere else, any of the pluses? We're all part of the human community. And it would be great if we could work toward that, even though we might not get there in our lifetimes. And then also somebody brought up that there's a process that LGBTQ people go through that could be very different from one person to another. For example, one person might feel, I need you to get to know me as a person before I talk to you about these kind of person. Somebody else might say, here I am, this is what category I fit, and like it or not, too bad.
Other thoughts? I don't want it to be a call and response thing where I jump back in, even though I want to. Go ahead.
Well, we were on the same page as you were in terms of is maybe everybody in this community, but then I asked for at the end of our discussion time if I or if someone is not LGBTQIA, is it acceptable to like impose into that community, if that makes sense? Like can I claim to be part of that community if I'm not actually one of those things? Or is it that if I'm an ally or an advocate, I can be in, you know what I mean? It's like, if it sort of feels a little bit like maybe it's not my community because I'm not really fully in it, but I want to advocate and ally, so how does that work? That's what we're at the end, talking about that a little bit.
I'm making mental notes of all of these. Does anybody else have a question? I want to jump back into my slides, but I'm restraining myself.
Kathy, that's how I felt too. It is a definition of a specific identity group of people within the whole community, but it is a separate defining group.
I think we talked a little bit about the fact that we wondered why it needed to be a defined group. We don't talk about the heterosexual community. We talk about people in general. And, why does it have to be a defined group? Why can't it just be the community of all of us, which I think is what you get at.
And of course, we stressed ideally.
Yeah.
It seems that that hasn't been able to happen, but it's a nice idea, isn't it?
Right.
It's a point on the horizon, a focus too. It's like if you don't ever choose that concept, you're never going to move to that concept.
You have to start something.
You always are just in this kind of fear, or like this, I don't understand, therefore I'm going to stay, I'm not going to be involved. But if it's on the horizon and it's something to look to, then you can go that direction and for understanding and building and breathing together.
There's a hand over here. I'm thinking about it. Okay.
Well, I was just wondering, if having that identification is part of being part of advocacy, you have to have some way to coalesce to provide effective advocacy.
And you've all hit on something that's been within the LGBT community a pressing concern since the 1960s, when particularly gay and lesbian groups started to politically mobilize, and that's, are we going to define ourselves as a separate group of people? This is what doctors in the 19th and 20th century were doing for people who exhibited to them homosexual tendencies. They were grouped into a group of people. But that wasn't for advocacy or mobilization. That was done sort of medically, and now we know that there is no medical basis like they were sort of coming up with. But then the question is, if there is no sort of basis to make this group, do we still do it for the purposes of advocacy? So I want to go really quickly, and then we can talk a little bit more, because some of these groups seem to work together a little bit better than others. They all revolve around these three major concepts, which are sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So the first one, sexual orientation, is the people you're attracted to, and it's as simple as that. You may be attracted to men, you may be attracted to women, you may be attracted to both, you may be attracted to neither, you may be attracted to some sometimes and some others another time. I like to describe it sort of like a sense of taste. I don't like tomatoes on my salad, and some people love tomatoes on their salad. Some people like cucumbers on their salad. I tend to love cucumbers on my salad. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but what I'm saying is the orientation you can think of as a taste, a preference. That doesn't mean that it's a choice. I don't know why I like cucumbers on my salad better than tomatoes. I just do. And I remember that every time I go to a salad bar. Gender identity is one's internal sense about what gender you identify with. Do you identify as male, as female, or as someone else that doesn't fit neatly into those categories? Do you identify as masculine, feminine, something else that doesn't fit into those categories? And then finally, gender expression, which is how you perform that gender. So if you identify as male or as masculine, how do you perform masculinity? Do you drive around in a Ford F-150 and wear your hat to the side and chew tobacco? Or do you, I was describing my father there. He would be very proud that he came up in conversation. But as we can see, those concepts of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are all very different. And a bunch of different people may find themselves in this community, right? So lesbians in this sense are women who are attracted to other women. Gay men are men attracted to other men. Bisexual folks can be either or neither and are attracted to both. But when we get to the other side of the diagram here, there are also communities like the asexual community, folks who are attracted to neither men or women. Or intersex folks, people who are born with basically genitalia of both male and female. Another word is hermaphrodite. And queer people sort of can be anywhere on this spectrum. So the question of the boundaries of the community, they're quite fluid boundaries, right? But it's something to talk about. What else came to people's minds? Yes?
I was thinking about how cumbersome that is, that series of letters.
Oh, it is.
And how...
And what order you put them in is so politically
well, it'd be
loaded.
nice to have some sort of respectful term that kind of said it all.
Uh-huh.
That's the problem I have. It just seems like it's going on and on.
And this is why people are using the term queer more and more often. Because in this sort of sex and gender vernacular, queer is more and more often coming to stand for a wider group of folks. One of the questions that was asked back here, which is sort of why there isn't a heterosexual community described in the same way, I could have put heterosexuality and cisgender up here. Heterosexuality is a person of one sex attracted to a person of the opposite sex. A cisgender person is someone of biologically male or female who remains biologically male or female with the sex that they had at birth. And we can talk a little bit about this as well, but I think one of the reasons why the LGBT community has coalesced as a community is because historically, within the church, outside the church, in the public square, elsewhere, people of an LGBT orientation have been thought of as different from the heterosexual community, and unfortunately often thought as less than the heterosexual community. So that sort of othering was done to separate folks who identify this way, who have now, in the late 20th and 20th centuries, come together and have mobilized as a community, even though the members of the community are really diverse. I feel like I'm talking a lot. I apologize. Does anybody else want to talk? What else came to your mind?
My mind is how we label, we're saying stuff about community. Is it just our culture here in the West that we do that? Because my understanding in some cultures, there's never been an issue that we're having here over LGBT. It's always been part of their culture and their experience. Is that why we say there's community? I mean,
That's a really good question. And this is one of the things I'm very proud of my discipline of anthropology for accomplishing. As anthropologists went to other parts of the world in the 19th and 20th centuries, they began to come back and say, there isn't so much of a stigma against same-sex sexual behavior, for instance, in other places. If you read any Greek or Roman history, you will find that in the ancient world, there was very little animus against same-sex sexual relations, provided they happened in certain frameworks. In the same way that, so every culture has a sort of different cultural understanding of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and a different understanding of how we're going to put people into different boxes. So our sort of Western conception of sexuality and gender has sort of different boxes. Yep.
In reference to Jean's question, it occurs to me, without digressing, but is there any underlying cultural reason why in the United States particularly we have done this in contrast to what you just described in the ancients or in even other current cultures? I mean, I have some ideas, but I'm asking if there's anybody's looked at that. Why here?
So the question is why we classify.
I mean, why do we do this and perhaps other cultures haven't? What's different about us?
Well, I think we have. Your question, as I understand it, is why we're classifying people in the way that I'm presenting right now.
And that we also, as Harvey pointed out, that we've identified them as a community. If I understand your comment correctly, that's not always been the case. They've been more assimilated into the culture than what we have.
Yeah. It's a really good question. It has a very complicated answer. No, but I'm happy to approach it because I find this to be a really fascinating topic. Why we have our concept of sexuality and gender the way it is today, and sorry to the group that I have my back to. I see it as a culmination of some very specific religious, political, and medical circumstances. So like I said, again, just to give an example of gays and lesbians, for example. In the 1800s, a German doctor started to receive letters from people in Germany and around Europe talking about desires for people of the same sex. And he, as a doctor would, treated these sort of case studies like symptoms and diagnosed this sort of medically. And the diagnosis he called homosexuality. And that was when the word was invented, in 1869. Before that, we didn't have a word homosexuality. We had people engaging sexually, romantically with people of the same sex, but there wasn't a word for that. There wasn't a word for an identity that sort of revolved around this attraction, right? And so then we start operating under this frame, right, that there's a specific group of people called homosexuals, and they are attracted to people of the same sex. And that's this, with this sort of basis in medicine, we started to make this community sort of more and more definite, even though we didn't really need to. And I feel like I'm going on a tangent here, but I hope this is helpful.
In those early days and continuing for many, many years after that, wasn't it regarded as a mental illness?
For a very long time, until the 1970s, when it was declassified as a mental illness. And now, honestly, again, most medical professionals, most psychiatrists treat same-sex attraction very much like your sense of taste. They don't really dwell on what causes it. Because if you dwell on what causes homosexuality, you need to dwell on what causes heterosexuality. And I feel like if we went around the room and talked about when was the first time you knew you were heterosexual, it might be kind of hard to put your finger on. Just the same way that if you asked me when I realized I didn't like having tomatoes in my salad, I wouldn't be able to put a date on it in the same way. Because people who are now sort of classified as heterosexual haven't been put to those questions. Nobody asks a heterosexual person, when did you find that you were attracted to people of the opposite sex? Or are you going through a phase? Like these types of things, these are questions that are never posed, but could be posed, right? And so the question I get is, the question I want to ask is if we need to come up with an explanation for same-sex attraction, we also need to come up with an explanation for why people are so opposed to same-sex attraction. Because that's also not necessarily within the natural order of things. This is also sort of culturally reinforced. I saw your hand again.
Yeah. I got my question.
Oh no.
No, I was thinking about the word community and how the choice of that word, and I think it's why the community has chosen that word. It wasn't placed upon them. That it's a word that's attempting to validate this as a real thing. It's a lot harder to discriminate against a community because a community has inherent value as we understand what community is, as opposed to discriminating against homosexuals or an individual or some sector of society. That's a lot easier to do. We do it all the time. So, and we've done that all the time. But to take an action against a community, that goes against what we think of ourselves as socially bad. We do that.
And as Americans specifically, I think, and I think this goes to your question of why it is this way in America, and it has a lot to do with the Constitution, right? The Constitution has very specific protections for groups of people who might be discriminated against, right? Discrimination on the basis of race, of age, of religion. Some of these are chosen behaviors like religion, and some are not chosen behaviors like race, but they're all protected because those communities represent sort of discrete groups of people, like you said. And so in the 1960s and 70s, people who were being discriminated against for same-sex attraction, for gender non-binarism, for being transgender, intersex, queer, what have you, realized that this could become or be treated as a group deserving of rights. It was certainly a group being discriminated against. And that's the way that we see the discourse playing out today. This is what we saw. I'm sorry, again, my back is to you guys. This is what we saw leading up to the Supreme Court decision in 2015 on same-sex marriage, the question of whether particularly gays and lesbians who wish to get married were a discrete group of people being discriminated against. And the court ruled that yes, they were in this circumstance. So America's constitutional protections for discriminated groups is another reason why we have the situation we have right now.
And the fact that we have the phrase community associated with these groups, is you see that as actually a positive step forward, because you just used the Constitution to show that it was useful, while other societies that exist in the world today continue to treat them as individuals and shoot them, right? I mean, so the United States is not at one end of the spectrum.
No.
Maybe not at the other end, but the sense of community adds to their chances of being motivated to be more inclusive.
Absolutely. And this is the sort of other edge of the sword, right? Having a community is good for political mobilization, but it's also good for opponents who want to discriminate, right? Because now you have a group of people that you can discriminate against. So we're seeing a lot of so-called religious freedom legislation going around in individual states. We may see one in Congress this year or next that wants to that does this exactly. It singles out a particular group of people and says these people you don't need to treat them in the same way that you treat everybody else. And so I think that's a good place for me to go to my next slide, which has really small writing, but I'm going to read it to you. And that's what's at stake in this debate. And again, you don't need to read this because it's a long list of what's at stake. So we hear most in the US about same-sex marriage. Not as much since 2015 when it became legal nationwide, but we still hear about it quite a bit. But there are many other civil rights protections and dangers that people in the LGBT community face that are less often in the news, but they're things that you can think about. And so here are some things that are at stake. And the big one, non-discrimination protections in private and public employment. So Ann Arbor and East Lansing first, and then Ann Arbor copied a few weeks later, were the first cities in the country to have gay and lesbian non-discrimination ordinances saying that if you were a business within the city limits, you could not fire someone because they were gay or lesbian. And now, several states, I think the number hovers around 19 or 20, and many, many, many municipalities have passed similar legislation. So, for example, the entire state of California or Rhode Island or Connecticut. The entire state, this non-discrimination protection subsists. In Michigan, it's a lot of municipalities. So Ann Arbor has one, Ypsilanti has one, Detroit has one, Lansing has one, Grand Rapids has one, but some of the other areas between those cities don't. Joint parent adoption. Even though same-sex couples can get married, in some states, adoption agencies can discriminate against same-sex couples. That was made legal in Michigan, I believe, last year by the legislature. Hospital visitation and inheritance issues. So again, when you're part of a same-sex couple, it's much harder to visit your partner, whether you're married or not, in a hospital, especially a religious hospital, because of the same-sex partnership. Housing and public accommodation, again, not such a big deal in places with non-discrimination protections, but in the vast majority of the country, those don't exist. So in many parts of the country, you can be fired for identifying as LGBT. You can be kicked out of your housing or your public accommodation or be denied those services because of that, and there's nothing illegal about it. I'm sorry that this is sort of sad, but I think this is important to talk about really quickly. Only a small number of states recognize LGBT-motivated hate crimes. So almost every state has a hate crime law, but a hate crime based on sexual orientation or gender identity is not on the books. And so data isn't gathered in those states about how many hate crimes on the basis of those identifications take place. There's a lot more. Medical access for people who are transitioning. In most of the country, people who are transgender, who are working on gender confirmation surgery, the hormones they need, are unable to get them, are not covered by their insurers. In all but, I think, 3 or 4 states in the country, it is legal to send a child under 18 years of age who identifies as LGBT to conversion or reparative therapy. I won't go into details right now about what that entails, but it is one of the most unpleasant things that I could describe to you. And it has a 99.9% failure rate. You might remember in 2012 when the largest conversion therapy organization, Exodus International, closed its doors and said, this doesn't work. And then finally, the thing that I want to move on to now is the issue of the participation of LGBTQ people in church life and ministry. So in the majority of mainline churches, again, the denominations I named at the beginning of the talk, compared to all the rest of Christianity in the United States, those groups are rather progressive. The PCUSA, for example, allows many of the things that in many evangelical, Catholic, or Orthodox churches you wouldn't see, including same-gender marriage and the ordination of folks who identify as LGBT. So sorry to sort of take us on that little thing, but I thought that was important. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to share about what came to their mind? The second question is related, so let's go to that. I also have this laser pointer, which I want to use at some point, so indulge me. What kinds of cultural, religious, or social attitudes do people in your family have towards members of the LGBT community? So again, this is sort of a big question, but let me boil it down. What have you heard? What have people been saying? What kinds of things did you grow up hearing? What kinds of things have you heard more recently? And then sort of where do these attitudes come from and what gives them power? So again, talk in your groups maybe for about 5 minutes and then we'll come back.